February 4th, 1987. It's a chilly Wednesday morning over in Tallahassee, Florida. Right in front of Myers Park, a blue van pulls up, and out of it disembark two gentlemen in their mid-20s with 6 kids aged 2 to 11 in tow. The men look clean, neatly groomed, and well-dressed in their suits and ties. The kids, on the other hand, look dirty, unkempt, and seriously malnourished. The odd-looking group immediately draws attention and suspicion, so someone calls the police, who immediately arrive and begin to question the suspects. The men give their names as Douglas Ammerman and Michael Holwell, and they say that they are taking the children to Mexico to wean them from their mothers and start up a school for gifted children. The looks of the kids, however, tell a completely different story. Besides their, scruffiness, the kids don't appear to be aware of basic living amenities and modern technology, including electricity, phones, hot water, or even toilets. More worryingly, none of the kids had underwear on, which raises suspicions of sexual abuse. Curiously, when the police try to question the oldest kid about it, she gets fidgety and shuts down the interview. 2 days later, police find out that the men and children belong to a Satanist child trafficking cult known as the Finders. A raid on the group's property in Washington, D.C. reveals damning evidence of child pornography, international child trafficking, and blood rituals involving children. As the public awaits a trial and conviction, they're shocked to find that the men are released barely 1 week after their arrest. Not only that, the children are also released right back to the Finders cult. Police explain that it's all a big misunderstanding and that the Finders are just a bunch of hippies, not devil-worshipping child molesters. The truth, however, is much more sinister. According to whistleblowers, the CIA stepped in and took over the investigation, claiming it was an internal security matter. And if you know anything about intelligence operations, that can only mean one thing. The child sex trafficking ring known as the Finders was actually a front organization for the CIA. The Finders may be one of the most storied cults in the history of the United States. This cult remained largely invisible to the public for decades, mostly carrying out its activities underground. But then the fateful day came when 2 members of the group, Michael Holwell and Douglas Ammerman, got arrested, like we were just talking about, and thus began the long and complicated investigation that still lacks a concrete conclusion even today, nearly 40 years after the group first came to the limelight. Here's how that happened. On February 4th, 1987, the Tallahassee Police Department received a 911 call from a woman in Myers Park. The caller reported that there were 2 suspicious-looking gentlemen at the park playing with 6 scruffy-looking children and requested that the police come check the situation out. When the police arrived, they met the gentlemen and the children in question, just as the caller had described, and proceeded to question them. But the men gave rather suspicious answers and behaved weirdly. According to the police report, when asked about the parents of the children, suspect number 1 became very evasive and stated that the children's parents were in Washington, D.C. Suspect number 2 refused to give this writer any information, and he pretended to faint when told he was under arrest for child abuse. Suspect number 2 fell face down on the ground and refused to stand up. He was carried by this writer and 2 other law enforcement officers and placed into a patrol vehicle. Obviously, these men were hiding something disturbing, and the police would get their first hint of what exactly that was from their interview with the children. Since most of the kids were too young, to communicate properly, police restricted their interviews to the oldest child, Mary. Mary informed the police that the two men were actually the kids' teachers and that they all lived together with other adults and children in a house in Washington, D.C. However, currently they were living in a van and traveling from place to place. When asked about their mothers, Mary said they lived in Washington, D.C., but that the kids were currently being weaned from them, so they didn't get to see their mothers much. She also mentioned that she and the other kids didn't go to school. Instead, Holwell and Ammerman taught them how to read and play games. And if they got the games right, they got a reward, which was usually food, specifically raw vegetables and fruit. Apparently, the games weren't restricted to the kids alone in this strange cult. Mary talked about a certain game caller and said that the adults in her community had to do whatever this game caller said. All through the interview, Mary and the kids were generally forthcoming, even opening up about not being allowed inside the house and how they had not had anything to eat all day that day. However, once the interview shifted to sexual abuse, Mary immediately closed up. Not only did she deny having experienced any bad touches from any of the adults in the community, but she also became very fidgety and wanted the interview to end. At that point, though, the police had gotten sufficient information from the kids, particularly where the finders were based. So with that lead, Tallahassee PD established contact with the DC Metropolitan Police Department, hoping to establish the identities of the children and perhaps learn more about the finders. As it turned out, the DC police had been onto the finders for a while now and had even been looking for an excuse to bust them. About 2 months before Holwell and Ammerman were arrested, the DC police had raided one of the properties of the finders, which yielded evidence of what looked like satanic rituals. At the time, the MPD claimed that nothing particularly criminal was found at the properties, which was why they didn't officially open a criminal investigation, into the finders as a whole. The claim would actually later turn out to be partially untrue, as you'll soon find out, but for now, let's just stick with these 1987 investigations. So, as the DC Metropolitan Police Department prepared to raid the finders' properties for the second time, they reached out to the United States Customs Service, since there were grounds for suspicion that the finders were a child trafficking ring, So this time, the raid yielded absolutely damning evidence, much more than the police were probably prepared to see at the time. To quote the USCS report directly, police found, quote, several computers, printers, and numerous documents. Cursory examination of the documents reveals detailed instructions for obtaining children for unspecified purposes. The instructions included the impregnation of female members of the community known as the finders, purchasing children, trading, and kidnapping. There were telex messages using MCI account numbers between a computer terminal believed to be located in the same room and others located across the country and in foreign locations. One such telex specifically ordered the purchase of 2 children in Hong Kong to be arranged through a contact in the Chinese embassy there. Another telex expressed interest in bank secrecy situations. Other documents identified interest in high-tech transfers to the United Kingdom, numerous properties under the control of the finders, a keen interest in terrorism, explosives, and the evasion of law enforcement. And that wasn't even all of it. The report also mentioned finding large collections of nude photographs, many of which belonged to children. In fact, in one of the photographs, a child appeared to be on display with their genitals specifically accented. Other photographs showed adults and children dressed in white sheets and participating in a blood ritual that involved the execution of 2 goats. One photo even showed children pulling out a baby goat from its mother's womb, while an adult presented another child with the head of a goat. Naturally, these revelations stoked widespread fears about Satanism and satanic rituals, fears that were compounded even more by the police themselves. Speaking to the Miami Herald, Officer Scott Hunt, one of the arresting officers during the February 4th incident, claimed that the finders were not merely kidnappers, but a satanic organization. And I quote, "It is our belief these kids were not kidnapped, but that their parents gave them away," said Scott, because one of the rites of passage into this satanic organization is that you have to give up your rights to your children, and that the leaders of this organization can do what they want with your children. And just like that, the finders went from being an invisible, secret cult to public enemy number one. All that was left was to round up the entire group and give them jail time. Open and shut case, right? Well, as you're about to find out, the finders are a much more complicated organization. And with this group, things are never what they appear to be at first. Shortly after the DC raid, the biological mothers of the children picked up at Tallahassee arrived to claim their kids. Perhaps the police expected to hear tales of how their kids were kidnapped and how the women had been looking for them, but that wasn't the case at all. Quite the opposite, actually. Like, everything these women said would completely debunk all of the hard evidence the authorities had gathered while searching the finders' DC home. The women explained to the police that their children had not been kidnapped. The men from the finders group had simply taken them to Kentucky with their full consent to work a construction job while they searched for temp jobs in California. The only reason the men and the kids were in Florida, according to the women, was that the construction job didn't pan out. So the men decided to take the kids to Florida for an adventure. A somewhat understandable explanation on the surface, but also a far cry from what the men themselves had said about their mission with the kids. So in response, the women blamed the men for lying about taking their kids to Mexico. Apparently, that was never in the picture. But then, what about all the hard evidence police had uncovered during their raid? Well, according to the women, the photos with the goats and the blood weren't evidence of satanic rituals. What the police were looking at was a simple, practical biology class to teach kids where meat comes from. When asked about the obvious malnourishment of the kids and the signs of sexual abuse, the women didn't seem to understand what the police were talking about. They insisted that their children were well fed and taken care of, and that they had not been mistreated in any way, whether sexually or otherwise. Whatever you think of these women's explanations, the police seemed satisfied with them. The finders might be an abnormal group, they conclude, but from what they could see, the group wasn't criminal either. To quote the police report directly, regarding the overall lifestyle of the group, it is difficult to compile complete information. The group appears to be one family, quote unquote, with all members having roles which include working, making decisions, and having other responsibilities. As to whether this lifestyle is appropriate and acceptable is a subjective matter. This investigator has learned of no group or individual actions that appear abusive or neglectful. End of report. With no reason to keep the finders' men in custody any longer, the Tallahassee PD released Holwell and Ammerman, and by March, the state of Florida had dropped all charges on both of them. The kids are also promptly returned to their mothers, by the way, and all federal investigations into the finders are closed. Until 1993. By 1993, it had been 6 years since the finders debacle caused nationwide panic, like it really was. Media houses had since gotten bored with the former cult du jour, and investigators had dropped their cases. One private citizen, however, would somehow stumble on the case in 1992, and fascinated by it, he would begin his own journey into uncovering the dark curtain shielding the mysterious cult known as the Finders. This man's name was Skip Clements. Clements was a resident of Stuart, Florida, and the very first individual to publicly link the finders to the CIA. The 42-year-old said he'd been looking into another child sexual abuse case when someone anonymously sent him a report on the finders investigation carried out by the United States Customs Service. According to Clements, the closing of the finders investigation in 1987 was not due to a lack of incriminating evidence as the popular narrative painted it. The finders were truly a child pornography and trafficking ring, and the only reason the authorities stopped investigating them was because the CIA stepped in and said it was an internal affair. The implications of this accusation couldn't be any more glaring. If Clements was right, and the finders was really a CIA internal matter, then that meant that the CIA had been secretly running a child trafficking ring, or at least collaborating with one. Either way, very damaging for a government still trying to shake off the bad name it had earned from its MK Ultra days. Of course, naturally, the CIA denied any involvement with the finders or investigations into the group. CIA spokesman Dave Christian even called it and excuse my accent here, nothing burger. But Clements maintained his stance and even took it up with Congress. There he found empathetic ears in two congressmen, Florida Rep. Tom Lewis and North Carolina Rep. Charlie Rose. Upon hearing Clements' account and going through the evidence, both of them admitted that the behavior of some of their colleagues suggested that Clements might actually be telling the truth. In fact, to quote the late Florida Rep directly, Lewis had said, quote, "Could our own government have something to do with this finders organization and turned their backs on these children? That's what the evidence points to. I can tell you that we've got a lot of people scrambling, and that wouldn't be happening if there was nothing here." The evidence Lewis was referring to in his comment was the customs report with the damning evidence linking the finders to criminal activity. Apparently, the report, which was prepared by one agent Ramon J. Martinez, also contained an outright claim that the Washington, D.C. Police Department ended its investigation into the finders due to interference by the CIA. Quoting Martinez, "The individual further advised me of circumstances which indicated that the investigation into the activity of the finders had become a CIA internal matter. The MPD report has been classified secret and was not available for review. I was advised that the FBI had withdrawn from the investigation several weeks prior and that the FBI Foreign Counterintelligence Division had directed MPD not to advise the FBI Washington field office of anything that had transpired. No further information will be available, no further action will be taken, no action to be taken on the basis of this report." Another report from the Washington Metro Field Office dated April 29, 1994, reveals that the individual Martinez was referring to in his report was one Sergeant John Stitcher, who happened to be the arresting officer at Tallahassee during the 1987 incident. Sergeant Hunt himself would also allege during a news interview that the DC Metro Police had handled the finders case, initially willing to help, but then suddenly backing out at the last minute. In his words, quote, "I have never witnessed a situation in which one law enforcement agency has cut the legs out from another. I can only speculate, but it is my belief that someone above the DC police shut down the investigation." With all of these serious allegations leveled against the CIA and the interference of the congressman, the Department of Justice was forced to open an investigation into the finders to find out if the CIA allegations were true. As it turned out, there were strong links connecting the CIA with the finders. During the course of its investigation, the DOJ came across a certain computer training school known as Future Enterprises, Inc. And based on the DOJ's findings, this was the school where most CIA personnel went to get computer training during the 80s. Now, where do the finders come in, you ask? Well, it turns out the school also hired several members of the finders during that same time period. Not exactly the kind of smoking gun you'd expect after the sort of bombshell allegations leveled by people like Skip Clements and Agent Ramon Martinez. Whatever this so-called link was, basically it was tenuous at best and non-existent at worst. And to make matters worse for the accusers, the DOJ would also confirm from Tallahassee PD that the narrative that it was the CIA that put a stop to the finders' investigation was entirely false. Neither the CIA nor any other US intelligence agency influenced the investigations into the finders. The investigation simply ran its course and came to an end. So, case closed, right? Absolutely not. Even after the DOJ's put its reports out that essentially debunked any relationship between the CIA and the finders, public debates about the true nature of the finders continued at heated levels. In fact, back in 2019, while declassifying all files related to the finders, the FBI noted that those files were among the most heavily requested set of documents from the FBI, proving the lingering doubts in public thinking about the way the finders' investigation ended. Generally, people belonged to one of two camps. The more skeptical thinkers leaned towards the belief that the finders were nothing more than hippies that Americans pinned their Satanist fears on. More cynical thinkers, on the other hand, insisted that the cult really was a front for the CIA, citing projects like MKUltra as precedents, and fair enough. Not long from now, we will explore the arguments on both sides of the aisle so you can come to your own conclusions. But before we get to that, this might be a good point to take a closer look at the finders themselves and how the group came to be. The Finders was started by one Marion Petty sometime in the 30s and just before World War II. Or at least that's what Petty himself says, even though his year of birth is given as 1920. Anyway, back to the point. Strictly speaking, the Finders didn't actually start out as an organized group. Petty simply opened up his house to anyone who cared to drop in, what you might call a hippie crash pad. Whenever he was asked why he did that in interviews, Petty would explain that he wanted to learn about money, power, and sex. And in his mind, the only real way to learn about these concepts was by observing everyday people and not by going to college. And that's exactly what he did. But as time went on, Petty's group grew in form and number, and from a ragtag bunch of hippies, the group evolved to become an alternative lifestyle commune with Petty as the head of the group. Now, living in the commune would eventually come to mean playing games. Basically, this involved taking orders from Petty and experimenting with life in the most unconventional ways. It was at this point that Petty became the game caller, as Mary referred to him in her interview with the police. With Petty, a game could be as simple and low risk as working a temp job as an accountant in a law firm, or going out with no money and being expected to come back with $100. Other times, it could be spontaneous and high risk, like flying to Japan with only 2 hours notice and gathering intel on a particular company. You never knew what the game caller was going to give you, which was what made living as a finder most exciting. But it was also what made the Finders a very difficult group to pin down, since members were constantly on the move, changing jobs and switching homes at a moment's notice. Perhaps the main thing that made the group difficult to comprehend was their unconventional beliefs. At the core of it, the Finders' subculture was marked by intrigue, whimsy, a strong sense of tribal affiliation, and anarchism. However, how that played out in reality was often weird, and some might even say disturbing. For instance, the Finders had unique beliefs about sex. As taught by Petty, the group believed that sexual relationships must always be initiated by women and never by men. In fact, at some point in the history of the group, Finders engaged in freewheeling polyamorous relationships for about a decade. But then after that, they commenced a deliberate binge of childbearing for a few years straight as part of a project to raise the next generation of Finders. The 6 kids found at the Tallahassee park were products of this experiment. The group agreed that the children of the group wouldn't be raised in the conventional way, with the nuclear family being the primary caregivers of the child. Instead, the group decided that they would raise their children as a community, which sounded great on paper, but didn't necessarily translate well in real life, as the kids were often ignored and neglected, according to, testimonies from ex-Finders and neighbors anyway. Despite these confounding beliefs, the Finders seemed to be a very attractive group to certain outsiders, people most would consider already established in life with great careers, spouses, and kids were abandoning all of that and joining the Finders in a bid to lay hold of meaning in their life. Robert Terrell, for instance, for instance, he was a 35-year-old venture capitalist who was pretty much living the American dream before he abandoned all that to join the Finders. As of 1971, Terrell was making nearly $200K per year with a house in Chevy Chase, a farm in West Virginia, and 50% equity in an oil company. I mean, come on. Yet barely a year after discovering Marion Petty and the Finders, he, Terrell, gave all that up, including his wife and 3 children, and joined the Finders. Today, he's quit the Finders, but he still hasn't gone back to his old life. That's how charismatic many found Petty. But you know what they say, all good things must come to an end. Whether the Finders were a good thing or not, you can decide that later. The point for now that I'm trying to make here is that by the 80s, the fabric of the Finders group started to wear thin and gradually break down. First, a group member died, and then a few short years later, the 1987 scandal happened. These 2 events caused a shift in the group's tone and in Petty's attitude. From a free-spirited anarchist, Petty transformed into something of a dictator. Gradually, members of the group that could no longer put up with Petty's increasingly controlling nature left, leaving only a handful of members behind. From this point on, it was a free-fall until Petty passed away in October 2003, taking his curious little organization along with him. And now that you know the basic tale of the rise and fall of the Finders, it's time to answer the million-dollar question. Were the Finders a child-smuggling CIA front or not? For most skeptics, and indeed most people these days, the hysteria that followed the discovery of the Finders was seemingly unnecessary. To these people, you and I, Americans, especially those from the right side of the political aisle, simply projected their fears of Satanism onto a mostly nonsensical group that really just wanted to be left alone, leading to widespread pandemonium over nothing. Now, there are many who have elaborated their thoughts on this. However, for the sake of time, we're only going to focus on the commentary and findings of investigative journalist Joseph Flatley. For those on the other side of the debate, the smoking gun that proves the relationship between the CIA and the Finders is that United States Customs report that we've been talking about, prepared by Special Agent Ramon Martinez. So when Flatley decided to look into the case, Martinez was one of the most important sources he looked up. What Flatley learned from his interview with the retired customs agent turned out to be revealing, but probably not in the way you're expecting, even if you're on the skeptical side of the aisle. Initially, after reading Martinez's report, Flatley came back with the opinion that Martinez was an extreme right-wing conspiracy theorist making up stuff out of thin air to justify his moral dilemma over his perceived rise in devil worship. But 5 minutes into his call with Martinez, however, his entire worldview was torpedoed. The truth was a lot more complicated than that. In Flatley's report, the investigative journalist reveals that Martinez seemed very sincere in their conversation. Something made Martinez believe what he believed. This wasn't just a conspiracy theory for him. He actually sincerely believed his claims, and, as it turns out, he had reason to. As a customs agent, Martinez revealed that he would regularly stumble on cases of ritual abuse even among children. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about any of those cases, as they were outside the jurisdiction of customs, and those who had jurisdictions like the FBI just weren't interested. Problem is, as sincere as Martinez was, his biggest evidence indicting the CIA seemed shaky at best the more Flatley explored it. In his report, Martinez had alleged that Sergeant John Stitcher, the arresting officer during the 1987 incident, told him that it was the CIA who put an end to the Finders' investigation and that the Finders were actually a CIA operation that went rogue. However, according to a heavily redacted FBI memo, no one involved in the Finders' investigation was instructed by any federal agency or State Department to stop the investigation. The investigation simply ran its course and came to an end without any interference. And as for all the evidence that Martinez claimed was discovered during the raid of the Finders' properties, Flatley echoes the sentiments of the Finders women that they are all actually easily explained. In his words, quote, "The satanic ritual, quote-unquote, photos were merely pictures of the kids observing as the livestock was slaughtered. As happens all the time all over the world, the group wasn't committing an act of Satanism, it was committing an act of agriculture. As for the photo albums, there used to be a time when you could take a picture of your kids without being accused of manufacturing child porn. But in the hands of zealous law enforcement, even the most innocent pictures can be misconstrued as pornography." Flatley also goes ahead to cite the assessment of Chicago psychiatrist Dr. Naaman Greenberg. I'm sorry about the names today. Naaman Greenberg, who was hired by the Florida Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services to assess the Finders' children. According to Dr. Greenberg, the Finders' children seemed a bit depressed, but other than that, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with them, nor was there any evidence of sexual or physical abuse on any of the kids. So, in light of all these contradictions to Martinez's claims, you're probably thinking that Martinez made the entire thing up. But here is the thing. Other evidence suggested he didn't. Think about this. In trying to defend their position, most skeptics have said that the photos with the kids and the goats were simply misunderstood. However, those weren't the only pieces of photographic evidence discovered at the home of the Finders. According to Martinez's report, there were nude photos of children, documents with instructions on trading children, along with other damning evidence. If the photos with the goats were misunderstood, were these other bits of evidence also misunderstood? And if we say that these other bits of evidence were made up, then what's the basis for accepting that the photos with the goats were real? After all, they were all mentioned in the same report. So, these questions and many more like them are what lead those on the other side of the aisle to the conclusion that the Finders were much more than just a bunch of hippies. to the cynics, the cult was a child sex trafficking ring that was in cahoots with the CIA, and the damning evidence and admissions from several law enforcement officers prove it. That the finders were a front for the CIA seems like a conspiracy theory at first blush. However, the overwhelming amount of files and documents from law enforcement that theorists have used to build their case is not one that can be ignored. We can't even cover half of it in this video, which is why I'm linking all my sources down in the description. So if you really want to dive into this rabbit hole with me, feel free to go crazy. In the meantime, however, for the sake of time, we'll just focus on the most explosive findings, which appear to prove to me that the CIA indeed interfered with the 1987 Finders investigation, effectively linking Langley with evidence of organized child trafficking, child abuse, ritual abuse, and mind control. It might be more efficient to start out by confirming that Agent Martinez is indeed a credible source before we bother building a case based on evidence mostly from his report. So, is Martinez credible? Naturally, there's no way to tell 100%, that'd be silly to say otherwise, but there are multiple corroborations between Martinez's claims in his report and independent sources. By the way, keep in mind that Martinez's report was dated February 7th, 1987, which is not surprising since he was part of the DC raid itself. So basically, that means Martinez's report was completed 3 days after the finders were arrested, which gives a very short window for him to craft such an elaborate lie. It also means that Martinez's report predates many of the statements and reports made by other law enforcement agents. These alone, come on, boost the believability of Martinez's claims. But let's go on to see how independent sources inadvertently affirmed Martinez's credibility as well. As you already know, Martinez mentioned seeing some photos depicting children involved in the slaughtering of goats, and this was corroborated both by news reports and declassified documents from the FBI vaults. Secondly, Martinez's description of the second finder's property in DC turned out to be an identical match with the description mentioned in the Tallahassee PD report of the same location. Both descriptions mention a library of books, a hot tub, a sauna, and satellite discs. 3. Martinez alleges in his report that he was told by a DC MPD officer that the finders seemed to have intelligence files on private families. Apparently, the finders had this system where they would respond to local newspaper ads for tutors and babysitters, and when they got the job, they would gather as much intel as possible on the family, although what that information was then used for remains largely unknown. Once again, this information, even though it was received secondhand by Martinez, was partially corroborated by an MPD intelligence report dated February 20th, 1987, which you can find in the FBI's vault. According to the report, the MPD reached out to an unnamed woman after finding her information and those of her kids in finders' files. Apparently, said woman had nearly hired a finder as a babysitter, which probably explains how her information got into the finder's files. Obviously, therefore, wherever Agent Martinez was getting his information from, he wasn't making things up. We've seen several of his significant claims indirectly corroborated by those who do not even agree with his findings. So, proof's in the pudding, right? Of course, this doesn't provide conclusive proof that Martinez's claims are 100% factual, but they sure do make his report worth considering. And the two main allegations Martinez levels against the finders are that they are a criminal organization and that they have ties with the CIA. Now, the question is, can the cynics prove it? Well, yes, they can. The question of the finders' criminality is probably best verified by their conflicting reports about whether or not the children were sexually abused. To begin with, besides the lack of underwear and Mary's suspicious behavior when asked about bad touches, The initial medical assessment by the Tallahassee Police Department, according to an article published on February 10th, 1987, revealed that at least 2 of the children had shown signs of sexual abuse. This totally contradicts the latter findings of the Chicago psychiatrist Narman Greenberg. Of course, you could say it's the word of Greenberg against the health officials at the police department, but you also have to admit that the initial assessment seems more consistent with the behavior displayed by the children than Greenberg's. Secondly, the mothers of the children claim that the finder's lifestyle does not abuse children. However, seeing the condition the kids were in when they were found, covered in bites and scratches and heavily malnourished, that kind of seems impossible to believe. But police report after police report showed that these kids were extremely filthy in their clothing and in their body, that they looked malnourished, that the van they were living in with Holwell and Ammerman was filthy, and that the kids behaved like they weren't used to living indoors. Another suspicious thing in this case is the issue of missing evidence. Martinez does make a lot of serious claims in his report, which ought to be easy to debunk or verify. Unfortunately, documents from the FBI vault on the finders seem to suggest that some key pieces of evidence, including incriminating photographs of young children engaged in sexual activities with adults, somehow went missing. The fact that these photos did exist at least at one point, though, is pretty much undisputable, because while the 1987 investigation was still on, both the US Customs and the DC Police made reference to them, even though they both differed on whether the pictures were pornographic or not. Whatever the case, to say that these photos somehow went missing is highly suspect. How could that possibly have happened? You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to speculate that someone is deliberately trying to shroud this case in silence. This leads us to the final piece of the puzzle: evidence linking the finder's cult with the CIA. And as it turns out, there is an appreciable amount of evidence. Let's begin with the findings of the DOJ. Now, as I already pointed out, the DOJ did find links between the CIA and the finders in the form of a computer training school called Future Enterprises. Tenuous, yes. The school was used to train CIA agents in the 80s, and the school had a finder on its payroll at the time. Now, according to the vice president of Future Enterprises at the time, Joseph Martinez, once the company found out that one of their employees was a finder, they immediately fired said person. But what Martinez doesn't mention, however, is that Future Enterprises had and still maintains contracts with the Defense Intelligence Agency. But it gets even better, because Petty himself admitted to having some connections to the CIA. His wife, for instance, Isabel, worked with the CIA from 1951 to 1961. Some even say her contract extended to 1971. And according to certain documents found in the FBI vault, someone among the finders, very likely Isabel, was given passports to multiple hostile countries at the time, including North Korea, North Vietnam, and the Soviet Union. Now, considering that Isabel worked with the CIA during the height of the Cold War, the fact that she would travel to these locations seems to suggest, to me anyway, that Isabel was likely a high-ranking agent, just like her husband hinted at. But an even more damning statement in the report, titled "Finders' Involvement with the Central Intelligence Agency," seems to suggest that the finders didn't just have ties to the CIA, they were also likely funded by Langley. A portion of the report reads, quote, "As a practical matter, what is not being said is as important as what SA, redacted, has said. Redacted acknowledged that we are treading on their toes and that they've had someone working on the case since February 5th when it broke. They apparently have a vested interest in Redacted and/or the group. They have not contacted any of the investigating agencies while they have been working on the case. They are also aware that redacted, traveled to prohibited countries during a period of hostilities that could only have been arranged by them. Finally, he stated that, redacted, this could explain a lot about the group's funding, which we have been unable to document to this point. But it doesn't stop there. Again, based on an admission made by Petty himself, his son also worked for the CIA. More specifically, Petty's son worked for Air America, the infamous airline that was a CIA front for moving weapons and drugs during the Iran-Contra scandal. I mean, this is a man who seemed infatuated with intelligence, worked in the military himself, and had an entire immediate family that worked for the CIA. What are the odds the sketchy organization he founded does not actually have any ties to the CIA? Now, if you're a skeptic, you'd probably say that this proves nothing, and technically you'd be right, but you'd also be wrong to say that this is totally inconsequential in light of everything we've seen so far. But if you're still unconvinced, here's one more bit of evidence, this time about Petty and by Petty, actually. In an interview with Steam Shovel Press in 1998, Petty discussed his early years in which he hinted at both interest and involvement with the intelligence community in the United States. Specifically, Petty mentioned that one of the main groups of people he opened house to were intelligence and counterintelligence people from Washington. Yeah, and he also admitted to running a private intelligence game where he would send people out to investigate various firms and entities, including the CIA. Petty's involvement with intelligence services was also confirmed by Robert Terrell, one of Petty's lieutenants by this point. In an interview with The Conscious Resistance, Terrell first denies any connection between Petty and the intelligence community, but then he relents and concedes that Petty was indeed training as an intelligence officer for a time in Europe, just that he was never assigned. Not only that, but Terrell also affirms in his interview that Petty maintained his connections with the intelligence community even after he left the military and started running the Finders. There's certainly a lot more to explore about the connections between the Finders and the CIA, from the open house and mind control parallels between the Finders and the CIA's MK-Ultra project to an interesting memo of unknown origin that more deeply explores Petty's career in intelligence. But I'll leave you to explore that rabbit hole by checking out the links in the description yourself. The bottom line, however, is that even with what seems to be overwhelming evidence of the Finders' criminality links to the CIA, you have to admit that it's odd that no member of the Finders or their children has ever come forward to confirm the cult's involvement in child abuse, child trafficking, Satanism, or intelligence activities. Instead, they all seem to uniformly and vehemently deny involvement with any of these things. Of course, one explanation could be that they were all threatened into silence, but Petty has been dead for 2 decades now and still no one has come forward. So shouldn't that be reason enough to believe the Finders' narrative that they're just an alternative lifestyle group? But then on the flip side, to believe that would mean to believe that Agent Ramon Martinez faked the entire report he wrote, which seems very unlikely when you consider the sheer volume and specificity of details involved, not to mention all the collaborations from independent sources. Which takes us right back to where we started. Who were these Finders and what were they seeking? Were they truly a CIA group gone rogue? If they were, then at what point did they go rogue? Or are they, as researcher Wendell Minnick calls them, dysfunctional adults who do nothing but lie? Maybe this is all just some elaborate prank that Marion Petty is playing on us from the grave, or maybe the Finders have morphed into a new identity and continue their operations in plain sight. If you were to ask me, with this new information and research that I did, I would say they tick the box for a funded CIA spy group. I mean, which group sends you to another country without a moment's notice to spy on people and come back with intel? I mean, not even a Satanist group does that. The people could be trained without knowing they're being trained, making them perfect as expendable people both, to the group and the CIA. But hey, that's just my theory. Don't take my word for it. Do your research with the links in the description and anything else you find, obviously, but, and come to a conclusion. And let me know in the comments below what you come up with. Whatever the case, and after everything we've talked about today, everyone on either side of the debate seems to be firmly convinced in their assessment of this odd group of hippies.